I can't hear you.
You're muted.
Yeah. Can you hear me
Yes.
now?
Yes, now you can hear.
Okay. So welcome everyone. Good morning and welcome to this morning's event organized by the Bengaluru Collective. I'd like to first of all, of course, thank Aijaz, Ahmad, our speakers, and N. Ram, both outstanding scholars and popular commentators on society and politics, both in India and elsewhere in other countries. I'd like to thank them for having so readily agreed to address this meeting, and we look forward to a very interesting session on the current situation in India, but in the context of what is happening globally. I do urge all of you who have not seen this book to get a copy. It is a set of essays and an interview of Aijaz Ahmad with a foreword by N. Ram. And I'm sure he's going to revisit many of the issues that have been discussed and raised in that. And for the benefit of those who've just joined, as I said, the Bengaluru Collective, a group of progressive young students and scholars and teachers and so on, including IT professionals from institutes in and around Bangalore. They're all ideas enthusiasts, and they've been organizing a number of discussions over the last 3-4 years. So with that, I think we'll just get on with the program and Ram, I invite you to take the digital floor.
Thank you, Parvati. Before I begin, I just want to request everyone who's not speaking, other than Parvati and Aijaz, to mute, because otherwise we hear all kinds of unwanted noises, environmental and otherwise, in this, and particularly when Professor Aijaz Ahmad is speaking, I think it's important to remember to mute, and then when your turn comes to raise questions, etc., please unmute. That's very important when large numbers of people are involved. So that's a request, and I hope everyone complies with that. Aijaz Ahmad, as is well known, is one of the important Marxist intellectuals of our times. He's an accomplished literary and cultural theorist. His best known work, there are many works, but the work that is considered iconic is In Theory, Nations, Classes, Literatures, which is a profound and acclaimed Marxist examination of the role of theory and theorists in anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movements. It's an important critique of some influential strands of post-colonial thought and theory, and especially a critique of attempts to pass off cultural relativist theorizing as part of the left. But having said that, there are many other subjects to which is addressed in a scholarly way. He's also, interestingly, a productive and widely published political commentator. Although he has said that he doesn't follow day-to-day politics often, he does bring scholarly gifts and other intellectual gifts to the examination of current affairs. And when you read a column by Aijaz, it's usually quite long. It has interesting citations, digressions, and historical insights as well. So he's a columnist, a commentator with a difference. What characterizes many of these political commentaries is scholarly rigor, a quickness to distinguish the wheat from the chaff, and a sharply focused eye on the relevant particulars being studied. And he has, of course, looked at some of the most important social, ideological, and political developments and questions of our time. Today, the subject is broad, making sense of our times. It's quite a challenge to make sense of our times. We are particularly interested in what's happening in India, but the international background to it, the setting for that, I think is equally important. And I think Professor Aijaz Ahmad needs to be given enough time to make his points and to pull together the different strands of his argument. The subtitle is Democracy, Debate and Dissent. It's not just on assaults on our liberties. That's an important part of it. It's much more than that. It's an attempt to capture state institutions. It's an attempt to see whether this can be done within the four walls of the Constitution. You need to characterize what is happening. Certainly, it's widely recognized that institutions in India are under attack or under pressure in different ways. State institutions have been captured, at least for the time being. The judiciary has largely been ineffective, I'll put it carefully, in responding to many of these questions. So we want to know, what kind of formation are you living in? How would you characterize this regime? Some people say that the time of fascism has arrived in India. Is it that? Aijaz Ahmad himself has written on this question and also been interviewed subsequently on this. And one of the things about Professor Aijaz Ahmad's thinking is his openness to refinement, modification, and even correction of what he puts forward in the best scientific spirit. And this, I think, comes to the fore when you look at what he has written on the question of fascism. I don't have to cite the various articles here. We can send you a list if you like. But this, I think, is very important. So we need to characterize the current, what is happening in India, set against the international background. We've seen what's happened in the United States, in Turkey, recently in Myanmar, and various other countries. And generally, theorists of democracy, liberal theorists, are very concerned about what is happening. And I read about a book that will be out soon called To Kill a Democracy, India's Passage to Despotism, by Debashish Roy Chowdhury and John Keane. And the flyer says that this book rejects the belief that India was once a beacon of democracy and is now being ruined by the destructive forces of Modi-style populism. I'm just reading from the flyer or blurb, what's been put out. It claims to detail much deeper historical roots of the present-day assaults on civil liberties and democratic institutions. The assaults come from various sides. Freedom of speech and expression have been attacked, but not just that. Freedom of movement has been attacked. Citizenship itself has come under attack. The idea of, the foundational idea of citizenship is equality of all citizens. So the very idea and reality of equal and rights-bearing citizenship has come under frontal attack by the combined forces of the Citizenship Amendment Act, the National Register of Citizens, and these are projects, and the National Population Register, and so on. So there are many things to discuss here. Also, the question of, in one of the essays published in this book, which we have been referring to, called India, Liberal Democracy and the Extreme Right, which is really a collection of essays published in the Socialist Register and subsequently in Frontline magazine. And it also includes an interview. Aijaz Ahmad examines the very interesting question of the relationship between globalization, neoliberalism, so on, and also the question of, he looks at this, what he calls this formidable claim made by liberalism in India, that the institutions provisioned by the Constitution are so strong and our values are so strong that even parties of the right, when they get into power, will move towards the center. I won't preempt what he has to say on this question, but that essay also needs to be read if you have to make sense of what is happening today. So I think I've just given you an idea of some of the issues he has written about and which is on our agenda. But now I invite him to please mute, please, those who are not speaking other than Parvati and Aijaz, please mute your mics. It's very, very important before our speaker begins. Making sense of our times, democracy, debate, and dissent. May I hand this over to you, Aijaz?
Thank you very much, Ram. Thank you, Parvati, and thank you for the collective as a whole for inviting me, giving me this chance. It's always a great pleasure. Now, what's very interesting about this title is that the word India doesn't appear. So it's very difficult to figure out, just at what level of generalization one is talking about. And of course, I'll come to the question of India, but making sense of our time, whether in India or elsewhere, I think it's very important to start with a much broader canvas, which I'll try to summarize as much as possible under essentially three headings. One, I believe that the fundamental characteristics of our period are determined, have been determined by the consequences of the defeat of the communist state project, if that's the way to put it, dissolution of the USSR, etc. The fundamental consequences of that are still unfolding, and I think we need to understand some of the salient features of that. Second, I want to talk about some of the technologies that have arisen over the last 20, 25 years, which are making a very consequential shift in production systems, in geopolitics, sociality on a day-to-day level, and so on. And the third thing that I want to talk about very, very briefly is something absolutely historic that is happening in our time, which accounts for much of the instability in global relations, which is that for the first time in 500 years, the center of capitalism seems to be shifting from the West to East Asia. The total output of the main East Asian countries is already larger than either the EU or the United States. So is the development of technology, in which between China and Japan, and now particularly the way China is progressing, the center of the great technological advance is also shifting from the West to the East, and that has been one of the fundamental monopolies of imperialism with respect to the rest of the world. And that is changing the geopolitical space and where India will fit into this rapidly changing world is also something of great importance for. All right, so let me first talk about the dissolution of the communist state system and the consequences of it, which are with us. The one is that for the first time, capitalism has become really a global system. The global mode of production, it never was until 1989. It is only since 1989, 1990 that you can date the emergence of capitalism as a truly global system, and hence the idea of globalization. The idea of globalization, I think, needs to be connected with this political development rather than the technologies. It has opened a great, vast new area for investment of surplus European Western capital in the formerly socialist countries, as well as purchasing of property and so on. And on the other hand, the world labor force at the disposal of capitalism increased by about almost doubled after the dissolution of communism. So the balance between capital and labor on a world scale shifted more dramatically than at any other point in the history of capital. Neoliberalism could not have been nearly as successful as it has been without the dissolution of the communist state system. It has had not only really deep material success as a system across the world, but an enormous acceptance by the whole of the muted, I do not know. How long has it been? Have you been able to hear me?
Yes, just temporarily. It was momentary.
Yes. Sometimes it's an unstable connection. You might. And it depressed the wage rate all over the world, not only just in the tricontinental zones, but also in the heart of the advanced capitalist zones. And the social misery unleashed by that collapse of the wage rate and immense increase in the army of the unemployed has been a very major factor in the rise of the right wing all over the world. This is the first time really in the past 200 years or more that nowhere in Europe do you have a powerful working class party. This, for the first time since before the French Revolution, it has never happened that you do not have a powerful labor movement in any European country at all. Syriza, Podemos, these are not labor-based political, the left parties in Europe, as they're known, are no longer, were really not class-based parties. These are left parties, multi-class alliances of various sorts. There are no working class parties anymore. Very interestingly, Foucault, by no means a Marxist, certainly anti-communist, probably also quite largely anti-Marxist, says something very interesting. He said for 200 years, the horizon of politics has been determined by the idea of revolution. What happens when this idea becomes untenable? What would be the meaning of politics itself? So what has happened then is that with the dissolution of the communist state systems, you also had next the collapse of social democracy. And increasingly, a crisis of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy became liberal politically only in relation to challenges to it. Once those challenges disappeared, I'm not talking about capitalist heartland, which affects so much of our own ideologies in India, so much of the state imaginary, as it were. So there is an overall political crisis in the ideological field, in the balance of class forces, and so on. Virtually the whole of the world state system then moved closer to the United States. Once I met P.V. Narasimha Rao, and I said, I hear that when you were chief minister in Andhra, you had written a letter to Indira Gandhi saying that the best way to stabilize Congress rule would be if we implemented land reforms on the West Bengal model. Is it true that you wrote such a letter? So, that discussion went in another way, but then I asked him, I said, what happened? How did you move into neoliberalism? And he promptly said, the Soviet Union died on me. Throughout the third world, whatever space there was for, with communism also, with the dissolution of the communist state system, social democracy died. Liberal democracy moved very much to the right. Non-alignment died. Any real non-alignment in which India was a very major force, probably the major force, was dependent on the existence of the Soviet Union. Non-alignment means mildly aligned with the Soviet Union and not aligned with the United States. That's what effectively it meant for countries like India, Egypt, and so on. Non-alignment was anchored in the reality of an alternative to this system. So that you had, you still had countries like Cuba or North Korea, so on, who are not within the American system. You have, periodically, you have some countries in Latin America moving in and out of the US orbit, but by and large, the sheer domination of the United States and the strength of imperialism. The second thing that I want to talk about is the rise of new technologies and what these technologies are doing and what the prospect is for society at large. What has happened in the last 20, 25 years is the growth of technologies which have totally transformed the nature of production, in the sense that until 1970s, production systems were necessarily national in character. Industries were national. You may be producing for the international market, but your production was, the main locus of your production was the national territorial boundary. With these new technologies, what has happened is that that no longer applies. Not only that there is a concentration of global finance capital, but it is also that production has been deterritorialized. That is to say, you have production chains that are spread all over the world. And for that, there are corresponding technologies which make it possible. I won't go into all that at great detail. But globalization in that sense is an objective reality in our new system, global system, in our new capitalist system. These are technologies which are also affecting the composition of classes. You now have a ruling class or intersecting ruling classes of the world who themselves are denationalized, large sections of them. There's an upper layer of the bourgeoisie in which people have multiple residences. You may be living in Bombay and another house in New York and another possibly in Shanghai and so on. You may have multiple passports. You are in a situation where more and more of Indian millionaires are now beginning to get residency or even a second passport by investing a certain amount of money in this European country or that European country and so on. So there is an internationalization and globalization of these classes, which with increasingly reduced loyalty to the nation or to the national capital. At the other end, what is happening is that with new kinds of automation, robotization, there's a contraction, irreversible contraction for wage work for the working classes. And for the working classes, wage slavery is now a minority experience. The majority experience is wagelessness, a wageless life. So there's a very strange kind of decomposition of classes going on in our time. We can come back to all that later on, but I think these are things that are affecting the way capitalism is actually functioning in India, which is then reflected in the way the Indian government acts. The third thing that the third point that I wanted to talk very briefly is what I said, that the center of global capitalism seems to be shifting or is in the process of shifting from Western Europe and the United States to East Asia. That is to say, China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, that whole complex of countries where production is in fact, the total output is already higher than either the EU or the United States. China alone, there are different ways of calculating these things. So different calculations will give you different results. But some people would argue that the United States, China has already bypassed the US in total output. Some will say it will happen in 5 years, but that's the kind of thing you're getting. China alone, let alone Japan and so on. That again, I think it's this is historic. This is the first time in the history of capital. And this is a very, very destabilizing factor. This is something that the West simply, Americans in particular, but the West in general simply does not know how to cope with. That there is a real economic shift, which in the case of there's an absolute stagnation. Pandemic or no pandemic, there's an absolute stagnation in American and European economies as compared to this. Hence, what Obama initiated under the title of Pivot to Asia and so on. Hence, that's where the lines are being drawn. And I mention it not only in terms of how radically the world has changed within the last 20 years. China was not a major power in 1995. It is within the last 25 years that it has risen from that to this global dominance. And it's not only just GDP. It is not just total output. You can imagine, China now has 110 to 120 people working in industry. 110 to 120 million. That is more than the United States and EU put together. Hence, this whole thing, realignment. In that, there's a very great question whether India will become, and let me first say, so what you're beginning to see is the rise of something of a global competition between United States on the one hand, China on the other, and alignments with them, with the one or the other. In that, India seems to be throwing its lot with the United States. This is what the latest meeting of the Quad, as it is called, that is to say United States, Japan, and Australia and India. That is what the visit of the US Defense Secretary to India indicates. The incorporation of India into the military system led by the United States, Israel, Japan, and so on. will you please not send me so many questions in the chat session? It's just very distracting. And I can't sort of shift now to answering questions. There will be time for us to discuss.
Can you ignore the chat? Can the chat?
Yeah, I think
hidden?
I think I should just, yeah.
Just get out of chat.
All right. It is this very broad, it is within the structure of these very broad global changes that we need to discuss the Indian situation. When I said, let me elaborate a bit more on the consequences of the collapse of the communist state system. You see, it is with the collapse of not only the communist alternative as a state system, the collapse of social democracy under the weight of the neoliberal offensive, and extreme class polarization that I've talked about, that the parties of the far right, or forces of the far right, begin to organize themselves on a scale not seen in Europe since the Second World War, or in the United States. The defeat of the left in the Middle East meant the rise of Islamism was very much, the Islamism very much filled the vacuum left open by the defeat of the left. You know, Muslim countries have been historically very receptive to communist ideas. Indonesia had the largest communist party in the world after Russia and China. And Indonesia is the largest Muslim country. Iraq, Sudan, communist parties at one time were the largest parties. In the 1940s, it was expected that Iran would have a revolution from the left by the communists. 10 years later, that thing shifted after the defeat of the left, and so on. So this is a trend that has been developing out of the context of this global context as a global phenomenon. And we can discuss that later on. So India, in that sense, is very much experiencing very much the kind of thing that is happening all across the West, all across the Middle East, much of Africa, this rise of the right. We can talk about that also, but I want to come very quickly to question of democracy in India. Democracy is a great fetish of our time. You can say you don't believe in God, but you cannot say you don't believe in democracy. You can say I am against capitalism, but you can't say you're against democracy. So democracy is this great fetish of our time. And it's very difficult to sort of talk about these things. The first thing that I think one should know is that this liberal democratic form is actually very novel, very new in history. Capitalism is 500 years old. Stable, liberal democratic form came to Europe really after the Second World War, just about the time we were getting independent. Germany, Italy had first established what turned out to be durable liberal democracies after the Second World War. Women got vote in China after the Second World War.
Please mute. Somebody is not following this instruction. Please mute everybody except Aijaz, Parvati, and me. I'm sorry, Aijaz, but yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Spain and Portugal became liberal democracies in the 1970s. United States gave equal rights of citizenship to Black people in 1954. Equal right of citizenship is older in India than in the United States. It's a very new form of politics. And still very unstable in most countries. So if it is unstable in India, it's not as if it's very stable everywhere else. Even in theory, John Locke, the great liberals, did not believe that they believed in racial democracy and male suffrage. Neither women nor non-white people had a right to democracy. Neoliberalism, Hayek and so on in 1930s said that the only job of the state is to enforce conditions conducive to the free functioning of the market. It has no role in social life, etc. So this is that's one. Now, what has happened in our time also is a general degradation of what liberal democracy you ever had. In the United States, in the last elections, they spent $16 billion on the presidential elections. Where does this money come from? In the United States, which is a relatively open system, you know that it comes from the top corporations. There's a wonderful book by Jane Meyer called Dark Money or something. But anyway, Mr. Modi's first election, he spent more money than did Obama on his elections. So Americanization of the electoral system in India in terms of money, how much money is involved. Forget about, RSS project and this and that. The very institutions are now so compromised. In the context of these remarks is what Mussolini said. Mussolini's definition of fascism was there's a form of government in which the state and corporations become one. And that is exactly what the electoral system now has become. So when the farmers say that Modi doesn't dare take back these laws because Adani and Ambani will not let him, they're right. When the President of the United States travels, when he came to India, Obama, the liberal president, he came with more than 200 CEOs from US corporations. When the British Prime Minister comes, whoever, they have become salesmen for the great corporations. Government and corporation has become one. This is, again, a global trend. If it is happening in India, it is no different than what is happening elsewhere. Now, how democratic has India been and how much democracy we have had in the past and what we mean by democracy. There is a there's a shell of liberal democratic institutions which have functioned in India since independence, except to a certain extent not so during the 2 years of the emergency or so. And they will continue to function. If by liberal democracy we mean the institutional structure, then India has been, India is, and will continue to be a democratic government. And in that sense, liberal democracy is functioning in virtually, in most countries where it ever took root, all over Europe, United States, and so on. But there have been some major shifts. One is the shift in the ideology of the state. What democracy is anchored in. I want to make a distinction between liberalism and democracy. Liberalism is by and large simply refers really to the institutional structure when we talk about liberal democracies. Political liberalism is something quite different, and political liberalism can collapse without the institutional liberalism of the form of the state. That's one of the things I've been arguing. What is under threat in India to a certain extent is political liberalism, what people talk about liberties and so on. I want to argue that this democracy in India was always essentially a democracy of about 10%. That the fundamental requirements, I think, for building a stable democracy were never really constructed in India. To have democracy deeply rooted in society, you have to have some degree of, you have to have an informed citizenry, for which you need not only press freedoms, you need education. You know, India, very early in our development, we elected to have, invest in the great institutions of the IITs and so on. That is to say, try to educate the top 10% well, and by and large neglect to second-rate education all the rest of the population. And it has been really that 10, 15% which has been a party to this question of liberties, freedom of the press, this, that, and the other. So it has always been something of an elite democracy. In order to have deep-rooted democracy, you have to have waged not just a verbal struggle, but a really fundamentally socially transformative struggle on the question of caste above all, on the question of religion and secularity, separation of church and state, to create a citizenship of all citizens, a state for all citizens, and so on. There was always an elitist bias in our democracy, in our education policies, in our social policies, in the very structure of our state institutions, and so on and so forth, I would argue. It was, that's one thing. How much time have I taken? Yeah, I'm running out of my time. I can see, but I'm afraid I'm going to take a little more time.
You have at least 20 minutes or 30 minutes.
Oh, very good, very good, very good. Now, let me put it this way. There have been, I think, 3 phases in the definition of nationalism in India. There has always been a definition, which is now very frayed and very now exists only in form, of a secular democratic equality of all citizens, which I think, which was then tied to an independent economic development leading to an autonomous polity in both economically and politically. I think the legacy of the national movement was such that that particular definition of our nationhood was remained very much the basis of the vision of India, whether or not it was practically implemented very much, but it was to a certain extent. And that is what what we call the Nehruvian period in its economic undertakings. I would say right up to Indira Gandhi's nationalization of banks and insurance and banking, where you wanted to, where there was some very serious limits to private capital. There was very great deal of protection for Indian economy from imperialist penetration. And there was some commitment to social and economic development of the oppressed classes and castes. For example, as many of you would know, the very purpose of that nationalization of the banks was to rechannel at least a good part of the bank credit to the farmers and to the agricultural sector and so on and so forth, especially the small farmers and so on. There was that definition of nationhood, of who we were. I think what begins to happen is that sometime in the 80s, and certainly with the Manmohan reforms or Narasimha Rao, Manmohan reforms of 1989, 1990, etc. The definition of the nation actually and national purpose actually shifted to our nationalism was not so much anti-imperialist, it was not so much anti-colonial, was now way back there. And now the great slogan now was opening up of the economy for prosperity, for development, for breaking the gridlock of bureaucratization, and opening to the world, which came very much at the time when the Soviet system was collapsing. So that now your relationship with the world were not protective of your economy. It was not so much a question of curbing the greed of your capitalist class, but actually to feed into that greed and neoliberal sort of definition of where your economy should go. And it's certainly true that there are upper classes in India which benefited a lot from this total sort of redefinition of what national purpose was. And great polarization of classes, which already existed, became much sharper after that. But there's certainly no doubt about that. I think precisely as that very short-lived prosperity associated with neoliberalism and so on began to fray. And as you saw that it was very much, it was very polarizing of classes into producing great wealth for the upper, whatever percentage, whatever it is, but not for the great majority of the countries. Slowly, I think a new content for nationalism began to emerge. And here, let me say this. Modernity is an extremely difficult process. Modernizing a country the size of India is extremely difficult, extremely painful. The country can very easily fall apart under the pressures of this kind of modernity, of modernization. And in order to keep the country together, you have to have a national cement, some ideology that holds your country together. In the first phase, right into the 70s, it was our independence from imperialism. We have made ourselves independent of colonialism. Now we are going to make ourselves independent of imperialism. We are going to make a self-sufficient economy of our own, et cetera, et cetera. And in the course of that, we will also practice redistributive justice. That whole phase, I think, comes to an end after the emergency. And this new discourse of creating a new India, a neoliberal India, is already in place. When Rajiv Gandhi comes to and gets formalized with but there remained a vacuum. And ideologically, that is the vacuum that the RSS, BJP have filled. Now, it is not as if they arose at that time. I think this is something very important for us to understand and keep in mind that in India, since the 1920s, when nationalism really became a mass movement, there had been a very great struggle over the definition of nationhood. Savarkar said, Gandhi's nationalism is a territorial nationalism. We stand for a cultural nationalism. India as a cultural nation, which is a Hindu nation, and so on and so on. Now, formally, of course, neither the RSS nor the Hindu Mahasabha or any of those organizations became very big. In fact, Hindu Mahasabha operated from inside the Congress until around 1940 or so. I forget the year when they left. But I think it's very important to understand that a very large part of even the Congress was very soft in Hindutva. Hindu right wing was not external to the Congress. There was a struggle inside the Congress over this. There were large sections of Indian on the political horizon, in which this idea of this being essentially a Hindu nation. This idea spoke to many more people than the ones who were actually in the right-wing politics. On the other hand, it is also the case that from the 50s, early 60s onward, much of the really Indian right wing outside the Congress began the RSS began to collect very many strands of Indian politics. The old elite of the old states, that the Rajas and Maharajas, various states of that kind. By the 60s, the Indian big bourgeoisie, very many of that, with the failure of the Swatantra Party, after that, they began to gravitate towards them. And the forces that congregated behind Jayaprakash, JP movement, if you look at them, they are really a conglomeration of all the right-wing factions of the Indian ruling class outside the Congress. And while JP serves as the liberal face of that movement, the real movement is run by the RSS. And it is with the it is really with the emergency that the hegemony in India shifts from that first definition of Indian nationalism to this other definition of Indian nationalism. That's the great watershed. On that, neither side comes out clean. It's a very strange moment in Indian politics. Now my argument here is that it is the failure of the Indian state in the first 30, 35 years, when the structures laid in structures of ideological nature, political nature, economic nature, that were created in the early years, they had an elite bias, and they did not create a popular base for democracy to take root, which was above races and classes, races and castes and so on. One great achievement was, of course, we, by and large, created a state, a composite state of the various regions. But the question of caste was never properly addressed. The question of the communal divide was rhetorically addressed. In actual material life, it was not. All the legal paraphernalia that exists against the use of religion for politics was never used, either by the Election Commission or the Supreme Court or local judiciary or whatever. Religion has always been a very big part in Indian politics. There was never, in fact, it was even said that Indian secularism does not mean a separation between church and state. It means equal respect to all religions. How do you respect all religions equally when you need votes from in a country where one religion commands 80% of the population? Equal respect for all religions is impossible in a polity which is based on universal suffrage. You need to get the votes from the country, and 80% of the population actually belongs to one religion. Heightening of religion in politics would necessarily create a communal, would necessarily strengthen the communal element. Now what's important, what's very interesting to me is that neoliberalism was a shared ideology between the Congress, the shared policy between the Congress and the BJP. It has always been. There was no distinction between the two of them when it comes to the actual nitty-gritty of the economic policy. The real difference then comes on the social policy. Above all, the question of what we in India call secularism. I think what happens is that the RSS has had a very sophisticated political strategy, which has brought them great success. First, they used the JP movement to legitimize themselves as a respectable part of Indian politics. It's in the first Janata government after the emergency that the RSS members came to occupy important positions in government. And the second phase, when they came to power with under Vajpayee, they used that period to create a liberal phase for themselves, that we will run the government exactly the way the Congress has done it, with minor differences here and there and so on. There was a liberal phase of Atal Bihari Vajpayee. He was as much a Congress RSS man as anyone else, but there was that. And it is only with Modi that RSS first appeared in its own right in Indian politics. That, I think, is connected with two or three things. One is the definitive decline of the Congress as a major political party in India. So there's a great vacuum created. And that vacuum comes into being precisely at the time when the left itself is on the retreat. Then comes the crisis of 2007, 2008, and so on, further contraction of Indian economy, more misery, and all that. And in that situation, the whole of the Indian big bourgeoisie, for the first time in Indian history, the whole of the big bourgeoisie coalesced under one political party, namely the BJP, in 2014. Indian big bourgeoisie has never been united behind anybody. The third factor is that, as in the United States and increasingly in Europe also, but also in the United States, it is a very oligarchic center of the big bourgeoisie, which comes to determine the politics of the right. In America, it is the Koch brothers and people like that. In India, it may be the Ambanis and the Adanis and so on. But the BJP, there's a long decline of Indian liberalism to the extent that by the end of the second UPA government, the Congress was already launched on a terminal decline. It was after the election of 2014, when I actually wrote that the great event of 2014 was not that Modi became prime minister, but that the Congress, which had dominated Indian politics for over 100 years, collapsed terminally forever. And was never going to revive, as the glory days were gone. So some of the sheer power of the BJP in our time is owed to this collapse of the alternative center of power in India. Some of it is owed to its sponsorship by the totality of the corporate capital at a time when Indian economy itself is corresponding to the kind of structure I was talking about, in which, in aggregate terms, our GDP, total output, is the third highest in the world. That's the economic heights. You also have, in that situation, India is 94th out of 127, I think, on the hunger index of the world. So on the one hand, you have this tremendous wealth at the disposal of the ruling classes and all fragments, all sections of it. There's a total ideological, political, economic unity among the beneficiaries of neoliberalism. On the other hand, you have these great crises. It is the absence of any great challenge which made it possible for the RSS to gradually take over openly the political spaces left open by the demise of the Congress, and to in fact appear in public as the true ruling class party. Now, Ram also said in his introductory remarks that that the institutions of the state have one after another sort of joined in this project of the BJP. I have argued for a long time that the model you have is not one of fascism at all, in which there is a liberal state and there is a moment of crisis, and you make a frontal attack on it and you take over the government, and you abolish political parties, so on and so forth. That is not what they have done. What the BJP or the RSS, remarkably, with remarkable success, what they have done is they decided to take over the state from inside. What I have described as the long march through the institutions. You take over the institutions of the state. You realize that the parliament is only one institution among others of the state. You take over as much of the bureaucracy as you can, as much of the judiciary, as much of the armed forces. So you have a great structure of acceptance for you when you come really to power. And this they have succeeded. This kind of consent for their project was already there. And now all these institutions, including the Supreme Court, is that this is a government that is going to last in the foreseeable future. And they have all sort of fallen in line. Question of democracy and debate, dissent and debate. Democracy, I think, has failed as a form of government. I think to have democracy, you have to have socialism. You cannot have, there is something deeply incompatible between democracy and capitalism. All capitalism can give you is oligarchic forms of power. Every democracy turns into an oligarchy because the sheer power of capital, which dominates it. I think democracy is best, not as a form of government, but as a form of dissent. Democracy belongs among the dissenters. And we have seen some of it, quite a lot of it, on one thing or the other. We had spectacular movements, first on the question of the Citizenship Acts, and then the Farmers Acts, and so on, and of course in the universities, and so on. Now, my discomfort with all of that is they're spectacular movements, of course. One is, and particularly the citizenship movement, it was so wonderful to see in India, Muslims fighting essentially very largely under the leadership of women, Muslim women, and fighting not on a religious ground at all, but fighting on grounds of citizenship, equal citizenship. Precisely what Indian social structure and now the BJP government has always denied. On that, this particular Muslim movement was very much like the Dalit movement. It is a struggle for equal rights of citizenship. Farmers' movement, again, it's a spectacular movement, but it is also a movement of a form of property which has already declined and has very little future as a matter. And it is a very defensive battle. It is trying to defend the system in which their social life has already collapsed. Peace Ainat has shown statistically that this famous rich Punjab peasantry, indebtedness is the general condition of this peasantry. Indebtedness is extremely common. That is to say, even before these three laws, the agriculture as it was going on in Punjab was not supporting their life. Now and I think it is the first really big movement on the question of neoliberalism. And that is why I think the government has dug in its heels. It could take back these laws. It has dug in its heels. We will show you. They are on a rampage to dominate all sections of Indian society. The dissent is rising. It is getting more widespread, but unfortunately it is taking the form of the way dissent has been rising. Elsewhere, the parallel in my mind is the Arab Spring, where country after country, you have immensely large uprisings, which get defeated one by one. And I think that is where the question of the organizer, how does all of this dissent rising from various parts of the country, various sections of the country, from Dalits, from women, from students, from farmers, from workers, great trade union activities and so on. How do you bring them in relation to each other in such a way that you can actually collect this great force instead of its remaining fragmented? That is where the real question of question of dissent, to my mind, really rests. There is dissent, there has been dissent, there will be dissent. The powers that be will try to suppress it best as they can. They will continue to have the structures of a liberal state, which will act increasingly in illiberal ways. All of that is there. But the dissent is happening in such a way that there is no political center around which these dissents can coalesce. And that, I think, is a real crisis in India at the moment. The building of that center around which these dissents can coalesce. Let me stop there. I've talked far too long. Far too long.
No, I think it was necessary to take this time to put, to explain and to construct your framework, and I really appreciate it. I think short expositions are not of much use in a serious forum like this. So I really appreciate this. Now, there's no point in attempting to summarize what Aijaz has been taking us through over the last several. Please mute. Please mute. He certainly helped us make sense of our times, not in any easy way. You got to pay attention to what Aijaz writes and speaks. It's so that you need to reflect on it. Some of the formulations will be provocative, some of them will be original, but he brings it all together. And today on the question of democracy, debate and dissent, which is only part of the whole framework that he constructed for us. But three important factors that he highlighted right at the start. When he talked about the fundamental consequences of the present, they've been determined by the consequences of the defeat of the communist state project, he said it, the socialist project, and the collapse and the decline of the communist parties, to rise of new technologies that have made a profound difference to production systems, geopolitics, and sociality, as he put it. And then a historic movement, something absolutely historic. For the first time in 500 years, he said, the center of capitalism seems to be shifting from the West, or is shifting from the West to East Asia. And I don't want to elaborate on that. And I think against this international setting, he looked fairly closely at what has been happening in India, not just now, but over decades, making several points, looking at what liberal democracy means, separating political liberalism from the institutional infrastructure that has been built up, pointing to the weaknesses of democracy in India, the elitism that was practiced over many decades, and so on. Not tackling issues at the social foundations, in particular caste, class, and so on, and also finally looking at the question of citizenship. And I can't really take more time. I wouldn't like to take more time in summarizing or speaking about these issues. I think you've got to listen to the lecture again. It'll be recorded in order to get the best out of it. But meanwhile, I'm grateful to Professor Aravindan Nagarajan, who has collated the questions, which will make it certainly easier for me, but perhaps presumably also for our speaker, Aijaz, to respond to them. In my experience, when Aijaz speaks, there are a large number of questions. And at one point, he was slightly irritated by things coming at him.
I'm new to this technology. You pointed out that I can just not look at them.
Yeah. So, but what I want to highlight is that they lead to many questions, some of them profound questions. And I'm grateful to Professor Nagarajan for doing this for us. First question I asked from Rajesh. What do you mean when you say left parties in Europe are not working class parties? How are they left then? How do you call them left then?
Yeah, you see, in India, we use the word left essentially to mean the communist movement. That is not generally the usage in Europe, for example. Historically, the left is defined as politics that is left to the center, whatever the center is in any given country at any given time. I was referring particularly to Syriza and Podemos. Both of them. Podemos basically has been talking about, it's a classically left populist government where it does not represent class politics as such. It has a programmatic commitment to resistance to neoliberalism, to redistribution of some redistribution of wealth in terms of reconstruction of a social state, in terms of health benefits, this, that, and the other, and so on. It is, these two parties are where left-wing social democracy used to be. They obviously want to look to the working class with their plan to gain their electoral support, because they talk about the social wage, they talk about, their program is one that would be attractive to the working classes. But they are not placing themselves as class parties. They are multi-class parties by conviction, by ideology, by actual composition. So that, for example, they even have a very tense relationship with the trade unions. They're not based on trade unions. For instance, they're not class parties. And yet, given the extreme right-wing character of the countries in which they are operating, they are genuinely left-wing parties in their context.
Second question is from Professor T. Jayaraman. He's asking the question, and before you reply, I just want to point something out so that you can take it from there, from your own writings. And the question is, are you including China as part of the capitalist world? Before you answer that question, may I point out that in this essay included as part of this book, India, Liberal Democracy and the Extreme Right, the essay Extreme Capitalism and the National Question. There is a little discussion of what Jayaraman has asked here, where Aijaz argues that while there may be a temporal coincidence between neoliberal dominance in a host of capitalist countries and unprecedented intensification of the globalizing processes, he then makes the important point: there does not seem to be a structurally necessary correlation between neoliberal thought and policy prescriptions on the one hand, and the long-term historical process of the globalization of capital on the other. I think this analytical distinction is important because as he argues, it is perfectly possible in theory as well as in practice quote, to accept the one without the other. And here he holds up China as the major case. And in his view, as presented in this essay, in the essay I just mentioned, while the Chinese government has embraced globalization with vigor and in full measure, it has, quote, embraced neoliberalism only partially, picking up only certain policies out of the whole package and rejecting others while safeguarding the leading role of the state and its control of the main financial architecture. I repeat, it has embraced neoliberalism only partially, picking up only certain policies out of the whole package and rejecting others while safeguarding the leading role of the state and its control of its main financial architecture. Further, he says the neoliberal policies adopted can be modified, restricted, and even reversed, depending on the practical results of an ongoing process. So looking at the broader picture, Aijaz underlines, quote, the crucial fact, I'm really actually reading from my own, the forward here, which deals with this question, the crucial fact that it is not the Chinese bourgeoisie as we now know it that has created the Chinese state, even as we now know it. It is the Chinese socialist state that has, quote, constructed the economic structure which has made the rise of the bourgeoisie possible, hothouse fashion. This leads to the sobering thought whether this current relationship between class and state will remain or get reversed. I hope this has been helpful, Aijaz, in answering this question, because I'm just summarizing what you have already discussed in that essay on this question.
Thank you very much, Ram, because, when one sits down to write, one expresses one's thoughts more exactly than one can off the cuff. So it's wonderful. Thank you very much for actually immediately finding that particular passage there. There are two or three things I would say in adding to that. One is that I'm usually very reluctant to take very strong positions on the question of China because of my lack of knowledge. I don't read Chinese. Most of the relevant material is in Chinese. By the time that some of that material becomes available in English, China has changed. China has been changing so rapidly that if you base your opinion on 10-year-old data or something like that, you will be making obsolete statements. It changes very fast. And I don't read Chinese. And that's a great problem for me. So it's historically novel, creating a historically novel system. And whether it is socialist or capitalist, misses the dynamism of what they are doing and why they are doing it. You see, by the late 1970s, it had become quite clear to, okay, your internet connection. Yes. By the late 1970s, it had become quite clear the Chinese economy had become very stagnant and something needed to be done. And out of that impetus came this. There is, I think, a theoretical understanding in China, which one finds stated here and there. Sometimes you find it in the writings and the speeches of Deng himself, that there really is no way you can actually make a transition. You know, China was the 6th poorest country in the world in 1949. There is a growing sense that after even 30 years of great revolutionary transformation, China had not built an economy on the basis of which you could really create what you could reasonably describe as a socialist economy. You had, and so on. I remember a Chinese education minister once coming to Delhi. He had come to meet, I mean, he had wanted to meet a group of Indian intellectuals, and I was one of them. And I remember he saying that, look, you can redistribute wealth, but you cannot redistribute poverty. And all we had in 1978 was poverty to redistribute. Yes, greater equality, greater this. We'll all be equally poor. And imperialism was just going to kill us. So they made changes in their policies, in their property structures, etc., basically creating, and I mean, in the same article, I have said that the current Chinese state is a compromise between its Maoist past and its ultra-Dengist present. China builds on the basis of its revolutionary legacy and guards a lot of that revolutionary legacy very, very closely. It opens up where it finds it necessary to open up, which is most places, and so on, but it keeps to itself not only the control over the financial structure, but also many of the heights of the productive economy are actually in the state sector, and so on. So it is really an experiment of a very grand scale, in which there's a transition, and it's a very risky transition. Well, you know, what the relationship between state and class will be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we can't predict. They certainly expect, even most recently, just 2 weeks ago, they have announced a new policy in which the presence and the control of the party over productive units will be much more strengthened than it has been in the past, and so on. So how much of that state control you should observe, bear, implement, bear, in what shape, and so on. It's a very complex thing, and what is visible to me seems to suggest that it really is a historically novel experiment. Very, very interesting mix of some of the capitalist characteristics of free entrepreneurship, but totally under state and party guidance. That unity of party and state continues. Its total guidance of the whole of the private sector continues. So it's a mixed, and it's in motion. It's in motion. China is very much in motion. It's very interesting to me that in 2003, when I wrote an article on imperialism, there's no mention of China in it. As late as 2003, it had not emerged as a major part, etc. So things are changing about China, and I don't want to make a definitive statement of that sort. Yes, it is capitalist. Yes, it is socialist.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. From Muzaffar Asadi, University of Mysore, question is, do you think the larger project of capitalism is completed in the present context? If so, why is capitalism again and again facing crisis from within as well and also from without? Has it been completed? If
yes.
So, crisis? Yeah.
We owe it to Marx to realize that capitalism progresses through crises, and it can survive any crisis which is not turned into a revolutionary crisis. Destruction of a part of capital and reconstruction on an altered basis is what happens in capitalism. Crises are fundamental to the very structure of capitalism. It does not threaten its survival. Unless there is a revolutionary force that turns it into a revolutionary crisis. Has it completed its mission? My own view actually is that capital completed its mission a very long time. And on the other hand, if you don't interrupt the life of capital, it will go on and it will expand, and it will expand in newer and newer areas of human life, deeper and deeper into any nook or corner in the world where value is produced. And uninterrupted, it will go on forever, or at least for the foreseeable future. If it is not interrupted by revolutionary force, I think capitalism has brought humanity to a kind of crisis which is also unprecedented. I think capitalism might have been viable when a small part of humanity, that is to say, the ruling class of Europe, were the only beneficiaries.
Yeah. Yes.
Capitalism that we now have is incompatible with hundreds of millions, possibly billions of consumers in the world. The planet just simply does not have the resources to sustain a capitalist system that will have prosperous consumers of that magnitude. Hence the ecological crisis that we may or may not survive.
Thank you. We have about close to 15 minutes before we need to close. Next question is from Ananya Kumar. Many critics argue that it is not unemployment, but rather underemployment, marked by the worsening working and wage conditions and informal work, which is what sustains capitalism. What would you say to that?
Well, I actually believe that is why I emphasize technology, automation, robotization, and so on. I think capitalism does not have the capacity nor the will to employ much more than a very, very small segment of the humanity that it has proletarianized. That is to say, the humanity which has no means of production of its own, the humanity that must sell its labor power in one form or another in order to survive. The great majority of such people, capital cannot give any jobs, nor does it want to. No matter what the level of exploitation is. Let me say very quickly that Foxconn, which is making iPhone in China with a very, very low wage proletariat, is going to put 1 million robots in its factories in order not to hire any workers. So capitalism is going to be based on wageless life, not on wage slavery. That is the true crisis of capitalism in our time. Our cities, all our cities, are just pools of this wageless labor, this class of people that live by whatever means they can find, but no permanent employment anywhere. So so-called informal economy, which is a polite way of people, which is a polite way of describing what actually goes on in their lives. Just wageless lives. They don't even want to exploit you anymore.
Another question, we have a few more, so as concise as possible.
Okay, yes.
From Rana Khan, given the realities of caste-based oppression and low literacy levels, isn't it too much to expect an informed citizenry?
That is precisely what you need to eradicate in order to create an informed citizenry.
Professor P. Jayaramu, I don't know what you can say on this because you've already spoken on it. Your comments on non-alignment as a foreign policy strategy in the present context. I suppose he means, is it possible, is it viable to practice non-alignment as a foreign policy strategy in the current context?
So non-alignment between what and what? Between United States and China? What is, who are?
Yeah. Yes, that rhetorical question is posed to Professor Jayaramu, P. Jayaramu, not Jayaraman in this case.
Yeah.
And then there are some more questions that Professor Nagarajan has flagged, has collated, saying if there is time. I think we have 10 minutes. From Marianne. In the Indian context, draconian laws are being pushed onto civil society, which are, by the present government. What are your views on this?
Yes, they are. And more will be. And it's not only that they will push these laws, our judiciary no longer wishes to protect us from draconian laws. It's yes, they exist. And that's why, I was saying that there's a lot of resistance growing all over the country against precisely such laws and implementation of those laws. But those resistances need to be brought together, coalesce under some kind of a political formation.
I detect a sense of hopelessness spreading, not just here, that some people think it is so bad that there are not spaces for resistance. So it's very good that you highlighted that at the end of your talk, the importance of these resistance and the prospects of resistance and the resources we can mobilize to strengthen this, to counteract this. Would you?
I mean, what I was saying was that not only that there are such spaces, but there have been some truly spectacular kind of resistances within the last year or so, of a magnitude that, that the agitation or nationwide agitation against those citizenship laws of that scale. When was there an agitation of that, a resistance of that scale, and led by not, organized, electoral political parties and so on, but really by people who whose lives were affected by it, and then an enormous support from all strata of life across the country. And it's only the pandemic that put an end to that movement. It was a spectacular movement. This latest movement of the farmers is spectacular, both in the scale of people, numbers of people, the regions covered in it, the length of that resistance, remarkable. These are historic movements of resistance. So there have been. The question is how to coalesce them all together and create a political force adequate to overthrow this government and replace it with something better than this.
Thank you. From Kamal Gopinath, how do you see the failure of the developed world to keep church and state apart, contributing to this global decay of democratic governance? The failure of the developed world to keep the church and state apart, and this has contributed to this global decay of democratic governance.
This crisis, this business of church and state being apart has been only partially successful in the West. America is a very, very religious country, has always been, from the times of, Tocqueville to today. I mean, something like 90% something like 80% of American Christians say that they go to church, etc. But above all, what has happened is that the separation of church and state was more possible and stable in Europe when these European countries were solidly Christian countries. Europe has never been able to integrate people of other religions into their society. Their separation of church and state begins to collapse immediately, because as soon as there is a sizable population of some other kind. And moreover, look, if you allow the major, it is an indication of the defeat of the left in the West itself, that this kind of Christian religiosity is rising against, let us say, the Muslim immigrants or things of that sort. So long as left parties were powerful in Europe, you did not have this kind of religious prejudice. It's also a question of, economic decay in Europe. Every time there is an immigrant comes into Europe, people see him as a threat to the job and so on. Europe's experience of separation between church and state has been exaggerated, I think, quite a lot.
Thank you. From Dear Aijaz, do you think the communist movement failed to provide an alternative vision that was attractive to the public compared with globalization? Of course, the contraposition of communist movement and globalization may not be what you agree with. Yeah.
If you're talking about India, that's one thing. On the global scale, I think what is called a failure, Alain Badiou has a wonderful article called What is Called a Failure. I think what happened on a global scale is that, let's say, in the Soviet Union and so on, there was 70, 80-year encirclement, military encirclement, economic encirclement of the Soviet Union. Communism did not fail, it was defeated on a battleground through armed and economic force after 80 years of warfare. In India, communism has always been, has suffered from the fact that most of our society really, I mean, there isn't a single political party in India with whom you could have a principled alliance.
Yeah.
India does not have a proper social democratic party. India does not have a proper liberal party. The question of caste in India, there are all kinds of social problems in which creating even as large a communist movement as we have built in India has been an absolutely spectacular success of an uphill task. Creating a communist movement in a country as reactionary as India is very difficult, and sustaining it over decades is a very heroic achievement, I think.
Thank you. From Dinesh Abrol, does Aijaz have any suggestion or suggestions to offer to the dissenters and the communist leaders? So it can take an offensive can be taken to avoid the defeat of the rising tide. Any suggestions? Yeah, I think that you've already responded to
We
that.
have got 1 minute left.
No, you can take 5. I'm going to take 5 minutes.
I mean,
So, because there's one other interesting question which is not part of what Professor Nagarajan sent me, which I think is worth flagging. Before that, Tyagarajan Jayaraman, Professor Jayaraman has said that he heartily disagrees with your description of the future of capitalism as wages, labor, but says it must remain a discussion for the future. So we won't take it here. But the question I was referring to is Surendra Singh Negi. How do you think the left movement can mobilize the organized sectors in India to bring forth the real issues before the current central government, which is aggressively implementing the neoliberal agenda at an unprecedented pace in the country, specifically when the mainstream electronic media is not highlighting those issues? And I think also it's fair to say the mainstream print media are not highlighting these issues. So that makes it worse.
By and large, I prefer to limit myself to studying what exists and not pontificate so much about what left should do and so on. And when I was in India, I played my own little modest role in the politics of the left. But ever since I was forced to leave the country, sitting abroad for the last 5 years, I think it's just not right for me to say the left should do this or progressive forces should do this or that. I can only offer my own understanding of what exists, and what needs to be done is for others to decide.
So thank you very much. I think this has been a rich experience for all of us. As I know that listening or reading Aijaz Ahmad is always that kind of experience. It's not something that you undertake lightly, because I think you've got to reflect on it. You've got to ask questions. You need time. So I would, for those who are seriously interested in this, I would suggest that you listen to the recording again, read the references, go to the references that have been provided. This book, India, Liberal Democracy and the Extreme Right, is only a small part of what he has written, theoretical and otherwise. But it does give you a good idea. But what he has said today, I think, has several things that are new, which go beyond what is available here. So I think we hope to have a continuing discussion or conversation with Aijaz. It's very unfortunate that he's not been, he really likes to be in India to study these things. And please note the modesty with which he said that since he's been away, he doesn't feel himself competent, or it's not appropriate to comment on what's happening right now without that kind of experience. And I really appreciate that. So thank you, Bengaluru Collective, and all those. I think I saw at one point more than 80 people have stayed on for quite a bit, which means this is of great interest. And may I now hand over to Parvati to say the last few words.
Thank you, Ram. Thank you, Aijaz. That was a wonderful morning. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, V. Sridhar, who will formally thank both of you from the collective. But before I do that, I just want to tell everyone that this is going to be uploaded later today. So we're going to put it up very quickly. And please do disseminate. Thank you. Sridhar, may I